afternoon. Welcome to our third lecture of the 2023 Rosalie Reynolds Explore History Series. I'm Liz Weisbrook, a member of the Duke Mansion and Lee Institute Board, and a member of our History Committee. Before I get started, Pat wanted me to tell you that we have a wonderful bar outside the door, and we now have a unique feature in that it is also a dry bar, so that there are non-alcoholic beverages there as well. So we hope that you slake your thirst after the lecture. As always, we want to thank the Wells Fargo Private Bank, our presenting sponsor for the past several years. We deeply appreciate their generous ongoing support. Our program is also sponsored in partnership with the North Carolina chapter of the Institute for Classical Architecture and Art, and of course the Duke Mansion. Our thanks to all. Now, since we last saw you this summer, we lost our North Star. So we would like to remember Rosalie Reynolds. Many of you knew her, and as the founder of our History Lecture Series, in concert with Tom Hanchett and Pat Martin, she's the reason we are here today and every other Sunday for our lectures. A few years ago, when Rosalie retired from the Linwood Foundation Board, I was asked to share a few words about her. So I talked to a lot of people about what set Rosalie apart. And here's a small portion of what I heard. She is a force, a friend, a ray of sunshine that illuminates all those in her orbit. Elegant, regal, serene, and welcoming. Humbly dedicates herself to doing all the good she can, whenever she can. What really defined Rosalie was her ability to bring out the best in people, with graciousness, enthusiasm, wit, and kindness. I think the third floor's history exhibit plaque honoring Rosalie is a fitting tribute to her. It says, in appreciation of Rosalie Reynolds, great ideas need a visionary leader. And then at the bottom it says, keeper of history, advocate for learning, lover of the Duke Mansion. We will never forget, and we will always remember, Rosalie, our dear, dear friend. And now I'm turning it over to Pat to say a few more words.
That was a wonderful setup. So I actually have a great responsibility today. Morgan, you want to come on up? Y'all are wearing Thank You Rosalie stickers, and we thought it would be great to take a picture of all of you. Just giving her a big wave, and we'll send it to her family. So we're going to do that. So get your stickers uncovered. Look at Morgan. Let's give Rosalie a big wave. I know she's watching. We're still waving.
We guys aren't in the picture.
Yeah, well, it's okay.
We'll get
you. The other thing I wanted to mention, some of you know that there's a garden here at the Duke Mansion. This is not the most beautiful garden day, but it has quit raining now. And there's a garden that Rosalie did on sort of the working side of the house that honors her mother, who was a lifelong friend of Doris Duke and Rosalie. So I hope that after the program, you might take a moment to go out there and stroll. You know, when you are a staff person, one of the things you're always looking for is amazing volunteer leadership. A lot of them are in this room with me today. And Rosalie was certainly that for me and for Tom. You know, we started this sort of crazy idea. We were just a couple of kids. And we decided we'd try it. And we had some afternoons where there were 4 people. One afternoon there was just us. And now look at what her leadership and your participation has done. So this is all thanks to her. She never gave up on the idea that we should be part of telling history, not just be part of history. And so we just want to thank her, and we'll send that picture along. She has 3 wonderful sons and their families. The other great little fact, we love to share facts, Rosalie is an amazing Charlottean. All 4 of her grandparents were Charlotteans. So we sit, and a ton of them lived in this neighborhood. So we are sitting right in the space where Rosalie came to be and lived her early life. So that makes it even more special. Tom, who's way in the back, I'm going to talk real slow, because he's got to get all the way up here. I'm going to hand it off to Tom. And again, I hope you'll stroll in that garden and just pause and think about what a great friend we've had and how lucky we are to have had her.
Thank you, Pat. site, many of you know the story, almost didn't exist. And what happened was the community came together and said, this is a place that we want to make lively, we want to have talks, we want to have tours, we want to have guests, and we want to keep connecting it to the community. And so there are a number of people out here who have been intimately a part of that, and Rosalie Reynolds was the one who I interacted with the most. For her, Doris Duke was a real person, not somebody in a history book, and the spirit of this place is a lot thanks to Rosalie Reynolds. So what we're going to do is first tell people about this wonderful book about Myers Park history. If you don't have a copy, they have multiple copies out there. Some people get one for every room. I suggest that. But we do this 4 or 5 times a year. The next one coming up, October 15th, is going to look at the Rosenwald schools, African American schools that were built all over the South in the first third of the 20th century. More in North Carolina than any place else, and there's a new film out about the Rosenwald schools and Black education in North Carolina. The filmmakers will be here. We'll also have an update on the Charlotte Museum's effort, successful effort to move and begin restoration of a Rosenwald planned school out of the Charlotte Museum of History. So that's coming up October 15th. What we're going to do today is hang out with a couple of mayors and a distinguished journalist and hear their thoughts about the history they made and also about the history we are making now. We are so lucky to have Richard Vinroot with us, who was mayor here starting in 1991, one of our rare Republican mayors, and someone whose background is as an attorney, educated at Chapel Hill, not once, but 3 times, twice. We're his scholars, an undergraduate, and got a Juris Doctorate at the law school. Next to him is a predecessor, Harvey Gantt, and Harvey Gantt served as mayor in the 1980s. He is an architect, and talk about having the background to deal with growing Charlotte, having an architect, having an attorney in our leadership was a really powerful thing, and his work with Gantt Huberman Architects. A chapter that needs a book. Someone needs to write a book about Gantt Huberman Architects. I wonder who could do that. Anyway, I haven't made that pitch to you yet. Fortunately, we have somebody who's better at talking than I am. He's even better at writing. Jim Morrill came to Charlotte in 1981, educated at Loyola University, and he was with the Charlotte Observer for about 4 decades. And is now writing for The Assembly. If you haven't found The Assembly, it's a kind of long-form journalism thing that looks at North Carolina. He was a 1999 Neiman Fellow. And I will just hush up there. Make welcome our panel.
Well, thank you, Tom, and I hope everybody can hear me okay. And like Tom said, I came here in about 1981. And for the Observer, and since then, I've covered 10 mayors of the city, including 5 in the span of 2 years, if you remember that. And I have to say, these are 2 of the very best that I've So I'm going to get into it. And Tom mentioned the growth of Charlotte, and since Richard was mayor in the 90s, the city has doubled in size, and since Harvey was mayor in the early 80s, it's tripled in size, so that gives you an idea. We all see growth all around us, all the time, and I just wanted to say that it's done a lot of good things. It's brought a lot of good things to Charlotte. It's also brought a lot of challenges to Charlotte. How do you guys think the city is handling those challenges?
Well, first of all, we need to define what the challenges are. Growth is wonderful. I was talking to a friend of mine just a couple of nights ago, and they were telling me about the city that they had that used to have about 125,000 people, and today it has 80,000, and they're losing population. And I decided that, I'd love to be in Charlotte's situation where we're adding about 100 people a day. That's wonderful. That says that we are attractive and we're drawing people here. But adding that 100 folks a day can have some diminishing returns if we're not very careful. And it seems like I've been talking about managing growth since I first ran for mayor back in the early 80s. And I still think it's very important that we manage it very properly. And that we deal with the fact that we are attractive to a lot of folks, both folks of means, folks who come here and engage in the industries that we're attracting, and folks who are seeking opportunity in the cities, but don't always come as well equipped to deal with that. So the struggle will be, and I can probably find 4 or 5 newspapers in the last couple of weeks that will talk about these issues. One of them is, how do you afford the population that comes in that does not have the means to survive in the economy we have? And we find them on our streets, we find them looking for housing. How do you deal with folks who are here, who are in fact subject to the growth of the city and the attractiveness of the scarce real estate, which then moves them out of affordable housing? And that's a big thing that the city has to deal with. So we're like a magnet, we draw people here for all different reasons. There's a segment of the population that we have to have the political will and the muscles to deal with. The other issue is, if we're not careful, congestion is going to swallow us up. Or maybe there's another way to put it, which is good at that. I think we have to look at our transportation and how we move people from point A to B as we grow and grow and grow and grow. Are we looking at this thing holistically in terms of a regional transportation system, or one at least that works in Mecklenburg County to accommodate these people that are coming in every single day and making it more difficult to get from point A to point B? So I'm describing transportation on the one end, on the other end, homelessness, affordable housing, and later on I'll speak about public education, which I've got to think about.
I came to Charlotte out of law school, and I went to Greensboro and interviewed with a big law firm there, and there was a man named Major McClendon whom I spoke with, and he said, "Son, why are you considering going back to Charlotte? That's a salesman's town." So, you ought to be considering Winston-Salem or Greensboro. That's where all the corporate enterprise in North Carolina is. If you want to practice law in a city with their big corporations, this is where you need to come. And he was right at the time, but the salesmen were people that became people like Hugh McCall and his predecessors, Bill Lee and Harvey Gann and others who were selling the city in a way better than anybody else. I used to go off, as Harvey did, to the conference of mayors when I was mayor a couple times a year. I never came back from one. They were always in a bigger city, from New York to Seattle. I never came back from one of those cities that I didn't think, I'm so glad I'm mayor of this city and not that city. But now, as I look back 30 plus years, we are that city. We are a top 15 or top 12 city, and I never at that time thought there was one of the cities bigger than us that was better than us in the ways that count. And so I worry about whether we get to be an even bigger city, and at 100 a day, we will eclipse a lot of those between 1 or 2 and where we are. But if we don't have a great public education system, I think our fate is pretty much their fate. It's a city with suburbs where people with means come in to do their business and then head out. I sat and talked at lunch for 2 hours with Andy Young. He was leaving the mayor's job in Atlanta, and I was about to assume the job here. And Andy said something I've always remembered. He said, "You're so lucky." He said, "Your business leaders go home to your city." He said, "My Hugh McCall goes home to Dunwoody, another city." He cares about us from 8 till 5, but after 5 o'clock, our concerns are really not his, nor his children, nor his grandchildren. We have to worry about those things, worry about whether we become, as Harvey alluded to, a city of poor people surrounded by people like most of the people sitting in this room who have the means to take care of themselves. And I don't know that we will break the code. I don't think anybody else has truly broken the code yet to make one of those 1 through 11 cities, if we're 12, great places to live. When I joined our little law firm, I was a Carolina guy in a Duke law firm, five Dukies and me. I was their diversity hire. and we're roughly 180 lawyers in 4 cities. We always lost young people, but for someone like me who came from here to New York or Washington or Atlanta. Today, we never lose anybody to those places. They come here because this is the great place of opportunity. But I can tell in 20 years or so, if we are, as we're going at this rate, 750,000 more people. At that rate, I think that's what we'll be at 100 today. We will be so big that a lot of us in this room won't live anywhere near where we are today. We won't want to live here. Most of us won't be here anyway. We'll have grandchildren. So I think we've got a lot of coping to do with the things that other cities haven't coped well with. But there's no alternative. You must grow. And you must figure out a way, as I said, to break the code. And we'll see whether our current leaders are able to do that. I mean, in some ways, Hugh McCall likes to say, and he uses Harvey's name almost every time he does it. And I had both of them in my backyard a couple of years ago to talk to young lawyers about it. We made a lot of good decisions back in those days. A lot of the great things here today are because of Harvey and Hugh and other people. And if they keep making great decisions, then I think there's a chance that we'll pull it off as other cities haven't. But I won't be around to see it, but I'm hopeful that we'll figure it out.
Richard, you offered a great segue. You talked about Bill Lee and Hugh McCall, and we had, back when you both were mayor, when each of you were mayor, we had something called the Group. And it was a group of business leaders, including those people. It was a handful of people who helped make decisions that were beneficial to Charlotte. They had Charlotte's best interest at heart. And as you said too, as the city's changed, the business community has changed. And a lot of the CEOs, the people who run the banks and other major businesses here don't live here anymore. The Bank of America chairman is in Boston. So I did a story about Charlotte a few months ago for Charlotte Magazine, and Hugh McCall told me, he said, it's not complicated. We had a plan and it was a shared vision. In order to get behind the project, you had to imagine it. We could really use a vision for this city now. And I just wanted to get your reaction to that. Do we have a vision for Charlotte now?
I think there are fine leaders in our city and county government. Now, look, I'm an R. I was a D. They're all Ds, there are no Rs. There's a one-party governance in virtually every major city in America. And also as bad, there's a one-party government in almost every state in America. The Rs are in charge of the state government with very few exceptions. And the Ds are in charge of the city government. So there's not as much disagreement and not as much, I think, chemistry going on that leads to a lot of good decisions. And in fact, I would say there's even a lower profile government. We elected with, I want to say, less than 1% of our population, essentially our city council last Tuesday. Or maybe it's 4%, but it's a very, very tiny percentage of our city. So I don't think anybody in this room you can name our wonderful mayor, but I think you have a hard time naming all the members of our city council. So we don't really know who to call and who to call on. They did, those 5 men, they were all men at that time, and there are many more women, thank goodness, these days, but those 4 men, including Harvey, did make a lot of the big decisions and get us on the right track. I tried to follow Harvey's and their lead by having once a month a meeting of the county and city and chamber leaders. Those were the three groups that we met and we met at each person's place, county 1 month, chamber next month, city, and we would talk about these kinds of things. And that led to a lot of the things that we decided to do. It led, for example, to the decision to build a light rail system and to be able to think like Harvey has just said, we must think about the transportation system for a long time from now. If we don't have 4 or 5 spokes at that time, 40 years from now, this city will not be worth living in. You can't pave your way to get to work in a reasonable way without a train system and a good bus system. So those are the things that we have to be deciding now, 30 or 40 years in advance, if we're going to continue to be a competitive place.
Good things. It's interesting, he's an R and I'm a D, but we've been friends throughout that. We don't see that as much anymore. The R's and the D's. There are a lot of things Richard believes in his heart, but I don't always agree with him. But I know it's coming from a good place, it's coming from good instincts. And that's why I respect him so much. Let me go back and share this vision thing. For me, Richard, I remember going into city government back in 1971, 72, when I got appointed to the city council, and heard about these meetings that occurred before the meetings. And I always wondered, who are these folks, these mysterious folks who could have that meeting? And of course, the mayor at that time was a preeminent business leader in the community, John Bell. And of course, he did get together with his friends, the Lees of the world and others, and often by the time we got to the regular meeting, the mayor seemed to have had some insight as to what we ought to be doing. Which was okay for a while, as long as I was a rookie on the city council, but got a lot more curious about whether that made a lot of sense for us. And so we became a little bit more active in that area. And when I became mayor, I got to sit with that group a little bit to discuss some of the things they were doing. Let me tell you why I didn't object too strenuously to that. Charlotte was a community that had a great deal of respect for its business leaders. It really did. And then I, being a student of history, noted that we never had any major social, conflagration of things that occurred here. There were no kids that got shot in churches. There were no outrageous members of the Ku Klux Klan who rose to leadership here. But there were business leaders who respected what Charlotte was and what it could be. I'm not so sure that they were all, quote, liberals, like we liberally use that word, or conservatives in that sense. But what they did have was a caring about their city. And if they looked at Birmingham and saw what was happening in Birmingham, and I'm sorry, there's some folks here from Birmingham, but back in the day, it got a negative reputation for its attitude about racial change that was eminent in this country. Charlotte's leaders made a very clear decision. Stan Brookshire, I give a lot of credit for this. When it was time, and history says you roll toward a period where you cannot avoid the inevitable. But when it was time for those lunch counters to be integrated, he reached out to the leadership in the African American community, got them together, and they all went to lunch and set a pattern. Well, that incident had a big impact on me. I was coming into Charlotte as a young architect working in a big architectural firm which obviously I was the only African American there in that period. And I watched how the leadership of this community was trying to shepherd this community in a different direction. Charlotte was always a community, in my opinion, that wanted to seek recognition. It wanted to be thought of as maybe even better than Atlanta. And so they wanted a good image to be projected across this country about what the city was. And Brookshire and Belk and others were proud that Charlotte was not going to be like some of the other sister cities in the South. I have a great deal of respect for that, and the general community had a respect for the business leadership and the decisions they made. So when John Belk talked about a 10,000-foot runway at the airport as a young council member, I would question why we needed that kind of expenditure. But then he talked about what that runway might do in terms of putting a nose out in front of Nashville and Raleigh and some of the other cities in terms of economic value and the jobs that could come and go on and so forth and so on. I had a lot of respect for a judge named McMillan who listened to a friend of mine, Julius Chambers, who talked about the fairness of integrated schools. So back in those days, even the vision for the city, formed largely by business leaders, and the new ones coming along, like Hugh McCall, saw Charlotte moving ahead as a city. And it was not going to move ahead with racial hatred and some of the other kinds of things that pulled us back to a past that none of us really wanted. I think eventually we trusted that leadership. But as the city grew, an interesting thing happens. The business leaders don't always know what's right for the community. Or at least they don't always hit the target in the center. It became apparent from my sitting in many city council meetings, the number of citizens that would come down with a vision that they had for the community that might have been a little different from that vision of those 5 folks who might have sat in that room deciding the future. And that led to district representation, which some would argue, even to this day, was not a good thing for Charlotte. I still think it is. I still think it is. It was the argument that I made back then, and I think I had a debate across the city with one of Bob Bradshaw about the merits of district representation as opposed to all at-large representation, where everybody was elected by everybody in the city. And sometimes the folks who won those elections won them because of the folks who voted, the positions that they took, the money they raised, and we didn't always get the diversity that we needed to have. I thought districts would do a better job in hearing everyone in the city. So we moved from at-large to district representation, and I always made that a marker for our interest in drawing voices from every segment of Charlotte. I thought that would build better government. Now, we're currently in a phase where some people have said to me, oh, that district thing ain't working out, because now you're getting people who are there for the wrong reasons, or they're too myopic, or they're too selfish, or they're always trying to get something for their district, and very few people are seeing the city at large as a whole, what's good for them. I think we're going to go through periods like this, where the representation is good, and the representation may not be bad, but the representation is democratic. I'm a little bit appalled by this lopsided city democratic thing that we see across the country. But if we examine that very closely, there is a good reason why that's occurring, right? People are abandoning, affluent people are abandoning the city, and the city is left to those who are in the middle or in the lower end. And therefore you get more Democrats who argue for bigger government, Richard, or government that will address certain needs that are not available to them with the resources they have. But even so, I think we can work it out. I think we are headed in the right direction. There are periods when we move forward very well with light rail and all the wonderful things it has done. And then there are periods when we backslide a little bit. But that's the way history is, isn't it? I mean, we move forward, we move back, we move forward. But I think in Charlotte's case, we're always moving forward. And what I see in my vision is that it will become a much more inclusive place beyond the borders of Charlotte itself to the wider region. And one way we're going to get there is by addressing this big, big issue of poverty and public education. So,
Well, you both talked about Charlotte becoming a one-party city, which it has, and you both were mayors, and you both had strong city councils that were pretty bipartisan, which was a strength, and people worked together. They didn't always agree, but they worked together. And let me just go to the primary that you talked about. You know, it was we had a Democratic primary on Tuesday. I think the turnout was 5% of Democrats, registered Democrats, and 4% of overall voters, which is pretty pathetic, as Julie Eiselt, I think, said. And, you know, I just wondered if it's time to, Richard, you probably couldn't get elected in Charlotte today. I know you could.
Not probably.
Is it time to do away with partisan elections? Does that disenfranchise, you know, a segment of the community?
You mentioned Bob Bradshaw, my partner, who I revered. Bob, my first foray into local government, I was appointed by then Mayor Ken Harris and then by then Mayor Eddie Knox to chair a charter review commission in Charlotte. It had about 18 members. One of them was a middle-aged Cliff Cameron, among others, then CEO of First Union National Bank now, whatever they are, Wells Fargo. One of the issues was that in many cities in North Carolina, it was a nonpartisan election. You just voted for the people. And Bob Bradshaw, who I've always revered really in every way, Bob said to me one time, and I think he made him come to speak to our committee, for gosh sakes, don't do away with partisan elections because parties have an interest in the quality of candidates. And I would make this statement. I would even say maybe don't do away with the rooms in which a lot of these people were picked. If you look at what we have now nationally, heading toward a presidential election with one man who I think is way, way too old to be president, and one man who is way too nasty and awful to ever have been elected president. But those two men are likely to be. In the old days, when the smoke-filled room picked the people, neither would have come out of that process, and that would be better for America than what we're about to see happen, I think, in fear in this country. So I'm sort of with Bob Bradshaw. I think I still believe there ought to be parties. I'm skipping away from your question for a couple of things, because Harvey said a couple of things that stimulated my thinking. I do think we're a better city than Atlanta, even with the problems that we're having in a big city. In fact, one of my good friends from college, Inman Allen's father was Ivan Allen, mayor of Atlanta. Inman told me a couple of years ago, he had a part of his business was here. He said, Richard, this is a better city than Atlanta for lots of different reasons. And I think he's right. I mean, that city is about to maybe even separate into 2 or 3 cities if some of the people have their way. I still think we have the makings of a great, bigger city, and we'll figure out a way to deal with it. I mean, this room full of people suggests you're thinking about these things, or you wouldn't be here today. I bet you wouldn't get this kind of attendance in many big cities today to talk about your city. So I'm optimistic about where we go and how we do it. And I'm not While I agree I could never get elected in this city today, and you couldn't get elected to the state legislature. I wish I had run for governor in this state at this time. I split the East. When I ran, I won everything west of Raleigh, and I lost everything east of Raleigh. These days, it's turn around. I think the Republicans have a pretty good chance in state elections because of what's happened. May not be good for governments, but it certainly is better for sort of partisan people. But no, I remain really sanguine and optimistic about, and I like and respect a lot of the members that I know in our local government who still, I think, see this big picture and see this city as a place of opportunity and a place where we want our children to come back and seek their opportunities as well. And for a lot of the reasons you mentioned, I mean, no, the all-at-large system that had 5 members of the county commission, a member of Myers Park Presbyterian Church, that is no way to govern a city. 5, I mean, I love the members of my church, but we don't have all the good ideas. And it wasn't fair, and it's better today with the system we have, so I have no problem with that. But we do have big city problems that are going to overwhelm these people, whoever they are, and I don't know them all, unless they commit a lot of time to what they do.
I'm sitting there just ruminating a little bit about how did we end up with a city that has the Democratic majorities that it does have. When we initially started with district representation, it was almost a reasonably even split between
Yes, it was.
Republicans.
I'm the only Republican mayor who ever had a Republican majority on the council party. I had 6 Republicans and 5 Democrats and a Republican mayor. That's never happened before and never happened since. And speaking of people you named, John Bell thought he was mayor for a lot longer than he was mayor. He would call me and tell me what terrible things I had said many years after he left that office. Rest his wonderful soul.
You used to hesitate going and asking John for a contribution to your campaign because you knew you were going to get a lecture.
Yeah.
For all the things you didn't do correctly.
We talked about Charlotte becoming a one-party city. Mecklenburg County is essentially a one-party county. So we're a blue island in a red state. The General Assembly is red, and it's not going to change anytime soon. So how do we go forward as a city to get things that we need and want? Money for transportation, Mayor. You led a task force called Charlotte Moves a couple of years ago, and proposed a 1 cent countywide sales tax, I think, to build out the light rail system and to change the bus system and do what we need to get people around. And that's gotten nowhere in Raleigh. So how do we go forward?
That's the thing that troubles me most. And one of the major differences I just mentioned earlier that the Republicans are my friends. If I go back to the era that I was serving here in the city. And now it seems to me the identification of the party automatically is a wall that goes up and you can't tomorrow. Some of you may remember this task force that I chaired a few years ago that was made up of citizens from across the county. The mayor appointed it, but it was one of the things I asked her to do, and she certainly agreed to that, was we tried to make it bipartisan, we tried to make it county-wide, so even so, some people thought they were not fairly represented. What it basically said is if we're going to address our transportation issues, we're going to have to make an investment. We cannot do it out of existing resources. And so the way that we thought the fair way, the committee overwhelmingly thought the fair way to do it was simply to add a penny onto the sales tax. And we said, we gave it a cute little name, 1 cent for mobility. And the sales tax, I thought was a fair way to do it. The committee also thought it was a fair way to do it because everybody pays a sales tax. People from Gastonia who get on our light rail, they pay for it. Or get on the highways that come in, they pay for it. people who are traveling, who come here, they pay the 1 cent sales tax. So it's not just a burden on the citizens of Charlotte. Most people thought that was fair. But what held it up, and what's holding it up today, hopefully I saw that we might have a breakthrough, is the fact that the Charlotte City Council, heavily Democratic, approaches the legislature informally, and they basically are saying, no, we're not gonna give Charlotte the right to tax itself. And I'm trying not to be political about it, but the point is no one got a chance to explain the merits of why this was important for healthy growth of Charlotte. And in addition to that, that the 1 cent would only come after there was a referendum in the city itself of people who would agree that that 1 cent should be imposed on them. But it never got, in my opinion, to a point where there was a reasonable discussion because there was this wall. You just couldn't break through it. And that's the way it is. And I'm not sure whether it would have been any different had the reverse been the case. That's what's so bad. If the Democrats were in control, they might not have wanted to listen to this. The regional prospect that we're hearing about now, which is to engage the counties around, they do have more Republican representation. And perhaps they will see that this benefits the region. And I have every hope that there'll be some sensible people there.
When I was elected mayor, the first weekend after I was elected, Judy and I invited to our house the mayors and their spouses of the surrounding, I think there were 7 cities, Kannapolis, Concord, Monroe, Rock Hill, Gastonia, maybe one other, that we invited to our house for dinner. And we talked about the fact that we live in a region that was deprived, as Harvey alluded to, of a lot of the things it needed, and that we all needed to work together. And I pointed out that in this region of these 5 or so counties surrounding us, 4 on our borders, North and South Carolina, and our city, most of the people in that region work all over the region. So while we might live in a city and elect our mayor and our council, the fact is the governance and the things that happen or don't happen were the responsibility of a lot more people, including those 6, plus with me, 6 mayors of the surrounding area. And I think that is still the recipe. As you noted correctly, most of those surrounding county areas whose citizens depend on Charlotte to go to the airport, to go, everything they do basically is done in and out of the city, are dependent on the health of us. And by the way, the health of us ought to be important to the legislature because about 21% of the state's revenues come from the city of Charlotte. I pointed that out to the legislature when I was mayor because I was unhappy, as you were, at their treatment of us from time to time. But our leaders now and in the future have got to figure out how to have a live and let live relationship with people who have different party identifications, because they both have an interest in what goes on here as we have an interest in what goes on there. We can't be a poor, strapped city and be anything but a problem for this state. And thus they ought to be supporting us in transportation and in our other needs of housing, appropriate housing, because the poor do come to the places where the activity is. We know that. And we've got to educate as I said earlier, our children and get them up and out so they can participate in the growth going forward. So it is a live and let live relationship, but we certainly haven't figured it out yet. We didn't really figure it out when I was there. Those sit down together and talk about it were good for our feelings, but I'm not sure we ever got a whole lot accomplished through that effort.
I want to open it up to the audience, but before I do, let me just ask you about something we're all familiar with, which is the news media. And back when you guys were in office, social media didn't exist. Cable news was just getting started. The Charlotte Observer had a much bigger footprint than it does now. So people are increasingly siloed, and I know this has national effects as well as local, but I just wondered what you think the effect locally of the changing media has been in Charlotte.
I'm appalled by it, and you probably read something, I'm sure you don't agree with them, but I write letters to the editor periodically. I'm one of the few left Republican citizens who doesn't like their editorial policy and will tell them that on a regular basis. And I worry about it. I don't think and I tell my children, I want you to get the local newspaper, not just to see who died, but also to understand what's going on in your community, so you care about it. So it really scares me that so few people buy our Observer, and it scares me that the Observer, it seems to me, plays to not people that think like I do, but people who think entirely farther left, like you are. Because I think more and more of my kind, maybe you like that my kind are dying out, don't buy it anymore and don't listen to it. I wrote a letter to them a few weeks ago and I said, I read the Sunday Observer and everything in there was from the left. I read your paper too. Surely you want to show a little more balance so that people like me will continue to read it and listen to you. But we've got to have a way to bring us together and champion the things that are important to our community. So it concerns me greatly, Jim, that there's not a thriving, growing newspaper with people like you working for it, saying the things that are important in our community that everybody listens to. And it concerns me that some of the people writing for that Observer aren't concerned about how people like me think, so they don't write to appeal to me. I say this, I went to UNC Law School. There's a goofy law professor up there who about every 3 weeks they have a column who's ripping the university leadership, ripping the legislature, ripping everything with an R by it. And he's hurting my university because the legislature, they hear that, they read that, they hate that. And they're going to take it out on my university. So that concerns me. Well, I think the people in the newspaper business ought to understand that there are constituents out there who are reacting to what they do and say, negatively or positively. So I want them strong and I want them fair and balanced, and I don't see that.
Well, Richard, I support what you've been doing because you have really appeared to be the loyal opposition.
Voice of the wilderness.
But I should share with you that I have seen some of their op-ed pieces that have been more to the right.
Both of them.
But my beef is that we don't have a newspaper that reflects the broader opinions of the full community, nor do we get all the news we can get and should be getting. And I do remember the glory days of the Observer when you could read everything from politics to government to the arts, and opinion was much broader, and it was a more robust, obviously, operation. But what's happening in Charlotte's happening nationwide. And social media has become the substitute, and we could have a whole session on that. I'm not convinced yet that we are better informed by information being as ubiquitous as it is everywhere. Just take your phone. I can tell you a lot of stories about that. I do think, though, that we allow that to happen, and it has an impact on everything from the elections the primary elections that you just mentioned. The mental health of the community itself is affected by this. The fear that comes out of if you became primarily a social media, or depending on social media for your information, how that produces some attitudes that really aren't reflective of what the general population is about and what's going on. So I do worry about our children, and the emphasis now on mental health, the fact that we're not getting balanced reporting. I have to search on television, and I know you figured that I watch MSNBC and you watch Fox News. trying to find the balance in the reporting, it's just difficult. You have to be an engaged citizen and want to really find out what the truth is. And a lot of people aren't willing to do that. So while we beat up ourselves about that recent primary, the fact is a lot of us didn't even know it was going to occur. A lot of us didn't even know it was out there. And I can remember the mayor's races that I ran in, the city council races that I ran in the 70s. Boy, that seems ancient now, doesn't it? And the 80s. The knockdown, drag-out races that were the center of attention in front-page news. Now, this primary race was covered on the back pages. We found out that Mayor Lyles was elected again. And she had a back page thing. I can bring you out newspapers that showed the stories on my election, and they went on for 4 or 5 pages, but you can.
I think we found out she was elected 2 days after the fact. Who has questions from the audience?
We know about the division in the country, and based upon your experience, what are your thoughts? Number one, are we going to be able to break it and get back to some sense of normality that has totally ceased to exist over the last several years?
I don't know. I'm taking the lead on this one. I'm scared to death of what has happened to the Republican Party, the people in it. There's some talented people who are vying to be the presidential nominee, and they're being overwhelmed right now by this a group of people that are out there who seem to like the behavior of this fellow that we had for 4 years. So I don't know the answer to that. It's quite scary. It's quite scary to me, and I'll maybe let one of these men solve it.
Solve it. I'm an optimist. I've always been. I believe we'll come through this. The one thing that frightens me is people understanding that our democracy really is threatened. I can't recall in my short lifetime, anyone who challenged an election and has done it so well that more than 40% of the country believes that the election was stolen from it. I read a lot of history, and I'm going back and trying to find someone who can make that argument stick. And I'm just amazed at the number of people who actually believe, even with all the evidence, all the charges, all the failed lawsuits, all the judges that said, no, it's a real election. There are at least 40% of the country that believe that it was stolen. That, to me, Richard, is the central issue. Because if we don't believe in our elections, that they are fair, democracy is in trouble. I'll stop right there, because that, I just can't.
I'm struggling with your question. I want to blame. You're looking at the least technological person in this room and maybe in this city. I give this anecdote to tell you how bad I am. I was supposed to pick up her granddaughter after church at a gathering where she was, and my wife was at Chapel Hill with other grandchildren. And Judy called me about 4 in the afternoon, and she says, Phoebe's been texting you since 2 o'clock to pick her up. And I said, what's a text? She should call me. I think a lot of what's going on in this country today is fueled by that. This all that I come to work in the morning and get out of my car. I go to work every morning, not that I have much to do, but Judy wants me out of the house. And I come in and I get out of my car and I see young lawyers looking at this. And we walk from our car to the elevator, and do this. Nobody says, hi, Richard. And they don't know who I am anyway, but I get up to my office and I have a phone. It's about 10 minutes between my house and my office. I do not need that in front of me for 10 minutes. But these people, young people, and maybe some of you are wedded to this stuff. And I think there's a lot of crap coming through this stuff that I'm inclined to blame on that rather than the old-fashioned communication, one with another, reason with each other. And I've already alluded to some of the problems. I think it is the fact that we've gone to all these popular, this guy's a great entertainer, the guy I'm alluding to. And we seem to like people like that. I mean, there are people on the internet that are really wild and crazy that have a following. So I guess it's not surprising that a lot of wild and crazy ideas come from that, and a lot of wild and crazy following comes from that. But we're not getting helped much by the other side either, by essentially leaving us with a fellow who, with all due respect, I couldn't do it at this age. I can barely talk to all of you. This guy's got a lot less to work with than I do. It's terribly obvious every day when I see him deciding which way to walk off the stage. This is scary in this great world of ours where these challenges are coming at us from everywhere. We need great leadership, and we're not going to get it out of these two. We're just not. It's a sad thing.
I will say that every time I wanted to get a hold of Richard, I used to have the same number for 40 years, and every time I call him, it's his landline at his law office, and he's still there.
I'm going to bring it back to the local level for just a minute. When you both alluded to the need for education, but we really didn't talk about that. So what are your thoughts about some solutions for our education problems, or school problems here locally?
We need to believe public education has value. That it has value. It trains people to become productive citizens in our society. If public education in this state does not work, the future is not very good. And I have seen the legislature do some things that I totally disagree with. And I think it is because they want to limit the amount of money that they spend in public education to a certain number. I don't know what that number is. But when you fund, and I'm not against alternative schooling. I've supported an organization you're part of, the Sugar Creek Charter Schools. But I saw those alternatives as ways of teaching the public schools to even do their job better. But when we now start to give vouchers to people who can well afford not to have vouchers and take that money from public education, something in my instincts tell me that's not fair. That's removing dollars that need to be expended in the public sector. If the public sector is hurting, let's fix it. If teachers are not being paid what they should be paid, let's fix it. Let's fix it. We don't show the muscle, the energy, the verb to want to fix it and to be single-minded about it. And it needs more money. There's a Leandro decision. I bet you, maybe this room does now. But I said that one day, and everybody came back to me and said, "What are you talking about?" As a judge, it made a decision that the rural schools in the state, and maybe the inner cities, were not getting what they needed, and he mandated that they, through some formula, that they be funded by what, Richard, $6 billion? Legislature says we're not going to do that, and they haven't done that. And they're cutting, they want to cut taxes. And I think they're doing that at the expense of a much more robust investment in public education. If we pay teachers more, and require them to do more, and if we encourage more teachers to go into public education, we're gonna be a better society in the end. Better teachers, better support for public schools, more encouragement of parents to keep their kids in school. And I don't mind the charter schools and the private schools that are there. I don't have a problem with someone who wants to send their kids to private schools. That's great. The Lord's blessed you to be able to afford to do that. But don't turn your backs on the public schools. And you know what? Years ago, I always said I lived in Charlotte at a very special time. I remember when West Charlotte was considered a premier school in the city, and I still run into students who are proud that they went there during that period. It was a period of busing and desegregation. And I remember folks from Boston coming down here to figure out how Charlotte did that and did it so well. That was a short period, though, a relatively short period in the span of history. But it did show me that we were on the right track to building a record that Charlotte wants to be recognized. Be recognized for having the best damn public school system in the nation. But nobody ever sets that as a goal to go forward. We've made attempts to do that. I think the private sector got together and wanted to raise about $50 million in one initiative. It did some good, not as much as we thought, but we're not going to solve that public education problem overnight. But we need to have the political will to start and stay on the trail to get there.
We disagree about this a lot, I can already tell. Phil Woolen and I are two of the people who started Sugar Creek Charter School. It has 2,000 very poor African-American kids. For the last 5 years, every single high school senior has been admitted to college. They're from the inner city. Vel and I went down to speak to the superintendent of schools when we started it, and he said, I hate charter schools, please don't do it. And we said, well, Dr. Smith, we're going to start this in the inner city where you're failing those kids, we're taking them off your hands. We have a waiting list of 800 poor African-American kids. I believe in school choice. I'm a believer from word go. If you want to tell me who public enemy number one is, I think her name is Randy Weingarten. I believe in choice almost as much as I believe in the Presbyterian Church that I belong to. It is the idea that you can take your child and put him or her where you think they're best served. And I know Sugar Creek's only one example with 2,000 kids, but we've done this with 3/4 of the dollars that the system has for the same children in the public schools. And we're beating the pants off of the same kids who are in the system from the same neighborhoods. It can be done. It's the hardest thing in the world to do. The hardest thing is not architecture, it's not law, it's not writing, it's education. We've got to figure it out in this country. And I don't know whether I've got the right answer or you do, but I don't think it's a matter of more money. I almost am of a mind that it's the little red schoolhouse that works. You found a great leader and put him or her in a little red schoolhouse and see if it doesn't work. But we've gone to these big systems and bureaucracies. I ask teachers every year at Sugar Creek who came from the system, what's the difference? And they'll say to me, Richard, the difference is if something's wrong today, it'll be changed tomorrow. If something's wrong today where I taught last year, a month later we'll get word back from on high whether we can change what didn't work. I just think too big doesn't work in education. Now, I'm not an educator, it is hard, but you and I don't agree on that one.
Yeah, we actually don't agree, and I think you come from a good place. In fact, I've been over to your school, spoke to the kids, impressed. But the one thing you don't identify is that when a parent decides to send their child to Sugar Creek, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It's a decision. There's a lot.
And they're getting involved from the get-go. So those kids are going to be, I'm talking about the masses out there that don't always have it. We need to learn from some of what you're doing so that we can apply that on a much larger scale. You can't build thousands of Sugar Creek charter schools across the state.
Mind you, Sugar Creek's in an old Kmart. It is the fancy building. It's an old Kmart.
I agree.
Let's recognize Jack for a question. Jack?
We have a question from Jack Clyburn, who was a longtime editorial page editor at the Charlotte Observer.
The city seems to be embarked on an effort to make itself a sports center and attract people from outside the city to the city to live in the hotels and eat in the restaurants and participate in the city. It seems to me the city needs something from within the city. What is your formula for working within the city to raise the spirits of the people who are here and people who want to see Charlotte be an even better place?
You brought us the Hornets, I brought us the Panthers, you go first.
What makes a better place, Jack, is, as you know, what I've been harping on, when I can send my children to a school and they feel good about that school and they succeed. And I'm pleased to say I'm a public school nut, but all of my kids did go there and they've all succeeded in that way. But also what makes it a great place is when we build the parks, we build the bike trails, when we make everybody 10 minutes, within 10 minutes of a public transit system that can move them and get from place to place without sitting in traffic jams or on highways that become parking lots. When we improve the quality of life by allowing the arts to flourish in the community, make the investments in those areas, we're building a better place that people will flock to. I don't have an objection to the fact that Charlotte becomes an attractive place for sports. I don't have a problem with that, particularly if it draws attention to our city and we have the opportunity to reap some of the benefits because of the attention we've drawn. The current efforts to try to do something with Eastland Yards is an example of an opportunity that might be made available that citizens in the eastern part of our city might benefit from. I just hope the council makes the right decision on that. But it's never going to get away from good jobs, good education, good opportunities for recreation, opportunities to enhance and yourself in terms of the arts in this community. Those are the basics. And the others are great attractions. It didn't hurt for Atlanta to have the Olympics. It wouldn't hurt for Charlotte to have a tennis 1000 event, which attracts people from all around the world. And the facility is bigger than just a 2-week tennis event. In that case, it is another opportunity for recreation that would be available to everyone. So I'm supportive of that. Just as Jack, as we have been supportive of the Hornets and the hundreds of millions of dollars that we're spending with them, and the hundreds of millions of dollars we're getting ready to spend with the Panthers. I guess those things need to happen. My wife has a big objection to us supporting billionaires who can do this without our help. But that's not the world we live in.
Let's have one more question, man.
I'm a long retired public school teacher, although in Fairfax County, not here in Charlotte. And I know the Economic Opportunity Task Force identified family structure as one of 5 areas that needed improvement. I also have statistics that show about 1/3 of our kids are now growing up in fatherless homes. and that's about 2/3 in the Black community. We have been working since 2009 to try to modernize North Carolina custody law to shared parenting. We've had 6 bills proposed and 6 failed. What can we do to try to change this situation?
I'm not sure I understand what the custody law would.
Well, about it. It is true, this is just one possible solution to the problem. When parents separate, whether they've been married or not, if the case goes to family court, between 85 and 90% of the time, mothers get custody and fathers are out of the picture. A lot of this goes back to money, child support, and even money that the state gets from the federal government for enforcing child support. Basically, what I'm saying is that our children need both parents in their lives, and that's not happening. And one way to start that change or help that change is to modernize custody law, to share parenting.
I don't have any answer to that, but I do agree with your question. I agree with the premise entirely. I just finished reading a book about Lady Bird Johnson and her husband, and there's a chapter in there that talks about the beginning of the end of 2-parent families. It has to do with our welfare system, which apparently, and I don't understand it, enough to explain it, led to what we have now are 1-parent families, but there's a clear correlation between having 2 parents in a house with a child and only having 1 parent in a house with a child. And we've got to fix that, that's for sure. Somebody wise, and I don't see many of them up in Washington, have got to figure out how to solve that problem, because we can't go on with these children, particularly in a great city like this where there are wonderful economic opportunities. And Jack, your question, I think Hornets and Panthers have promoted a lot of the great businesses and people who've come to this community through our facilities to come here because they know they can use our airport to go back to the world with their product. And we've got to have people here that are capable of working in their businesses and making them succeed. So it's all tied together. But there's absolutely a correlation between 1 parent and children who are out on the streets and not making it through our system. We got to fix that. This America is, but I will say the good news is this: the poorest people in America, are in the top 10% in the world. We're in the greatest country in the world with 330 million people, and we ought to be able to figure this one out. We've got too much good going for us to let this bring us down, and it shan't. I think ultimately we'll figure it out.
I agree with Richard. I agree with you. I think that my own history, all the folks that I know that have succeeded or managed to do well in this 21st century economy, and looking back even a couple of generations, the root of their success, white and black, has been a 2-parent family. But I don't want to be negative in the sense that 1 parent can't raise the children. There are 1-parent families all over the place, as you just pointed out in your statistics. The difference is how we define family now. I'm serious. I mean, how do we define families? Is it just the nuclear family that we're too familiar with? Or do you live in a neighborhood where there's a single parent trying to raise a child? And are you helping as neighbors to raise that child too? So I think family goes just beyond the standard definition. Now, I'm going to tell you what I think, and it may be unpleasant to a lot of people, but I do, which you alluded to a little bit, but the welfare system encouraged substantially the father being not present. We all know that story. For some reason, we had a bias against a man in the family getting subsidy from the government he should be out there working. And a lot of times there was no place for him to go work. So he hid away while the welfare came to the mother, or he never got married to her because it made no sense. Most young black men that I talk to, if they struggle on the issue of marriage, it is, I got no way to support a wife and kids. My job pays $7.50 an hour. How am I gonna, I can barely survive. Which is when I'm back to that education thing again. They ought to be making $22 an hour. And they could if there was enough push in the system to get more of them engaged in education and moving up. Then they would be in the position that I've got girls, and every single one of them is married, and when they got married, first thing I wanted to know was, can you support my dog? And obviously that made for a happier situation, because they could. So why shouldn't that be a way that we look at what we need to be doing to nurture these kids, to keep them in school? Because if we don't, it really comes back to bite us in another way. All of us, corporately, in terms of the poverty and all the cost of that and so forth and so on. But we kind of encourage that by that welfare system that got started in the 30s. And it didn't help.
Want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to thank our neighbors.
Thank you.